Hello, you are listening to the COVID Inquiry podcast by PA Duffy & Co Solicitors, supported by Broudie Canter Solicitors. Hosted by Enda McGarrity from PA Duffy & Co Solicitors and Claire McNeilly, Senior Associate from Lanyon Group. The COVID Inquiry podcast will provide commentary, expert insight and opinion on the Module 2C public hearings, which are investigating core decision-making and political governance in Northern Ireland during the pandemic. Each week, Enda and Claire will be joined by guests to discuss evidence from the inquiry. Their interviews will bring listeners up to date with the implications from the Module 2C evidential hearings in a comprehensive and, most importantly, accessible manner. This week, Enda and Claire are joined by Fiona Humphries, a member of the Northern Ireland COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group; Nicola Brook, Associate Director and Solicitor in the Major Inquests and Inquiries Department at Broudie Canter Solicitors; and myself, Sarah Kirk, Paralegal on the UK COVID-19 Inquiry Team at PA Duffy & Co Solicitors. Together, we will reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the PA Duffy COVID-19 Inquiry podcast with me, journalist Claire McNeilly, and my co-host Enda McGarrity, one of the lead solicitors representing the Northern Ireland Bereaved Families for Justice. Today, we're looking at evidence from key witnesses during week 2 of Module 2C sitting in Belfast. Earlier this week, we heard from Richard Pengelly, former Permanent Secretary for the Department of Health, and Northern Ireland's Chief Scientific Officer, Professor Ian Young. Giving evidence yesterday were Lord Peter Weir of Ballyholme, former Minister for Education, Diane Dodds, the former Economy Minister, and both Deirdre Horgy and Carol Nicolan, former Ministers for Communities. Also appearing were Northern Ireland Justice Minister Naomi Long, Edwin Poots, the former Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs Minister, and Brandon Lewis, former Northern Ireland Secretary of State. At this stage, I should mention that Professor Sir Michael McBride, Northern Ireland's Chief Medical Officer, hasn't yet appeared before the inquiry. He's due up tomorrow and will examine his evidence in detail on next week's podcast. Joining us today are Nicola Brook, who represents the UK Bereaved Families for Justice, Fiona Humphries, a member of the local campaign group who lost both of her parents to COVID, and Sarah Kirk, a PA Duffy paralegal representing the Northern Ireland COVID Bereaved Families for Justice. And before we take a deep dive into the big talking points, could you please give us your reflections on a busy week of evidence so far?
Yeah, no problem. So it's been a very hectic week too, with plenty of evidence to unpack. We've had a detailed examination of some of the core issues in this module, including the attendance of Sinn Féin ministers at the funeral of Bobby Story, the DUP's decision to call for a cross-community vote against the extension of public health measures in autumn 2020, and the silo approach adopted by the Department for Health and the impact that had on the whole government response. Before we get into the details of this with our guests, I think it's appropriate to look again at the human impact of these decisions. And Fiona, you lost both of your parents within 4 days to COVID-19. It's difficult to think of a more harrowing example of the true impact of the pandemic. Would you mind sharing a bit about that?
Yeah, so my parents they both died in May 2020. So just as a bit of preamble to how events unfolded for them, my dad he turned 90 while he was in hospital, but he had suffered a stroke 10 years previous, and my mother had been his main carer then for 10 years. So Daddy was pretty incapacitated, was severely affected by a stroke. My mother, on the other hand, was fit and healthy. She was 83. On sort of mid-April, the carers who used to come in and help with social care for my dad thought he might have suffered some sort of internal bleed. So they wanted him to go to hospital basically to investigate that further. So on the 15th of April, he was brought to hospital. He was tested for COVID on admission and was negative. He then, he was in hospital for a week. He underwent the exploratory procedure, which revealed that there was no further treatment required for the suspected bleed. While he was in there, his health deteriorated relative to how it was prior to admission, and they thought he had acquired pneumonia while he was in there. So they treated him for that. 9 days later, he was due for discharge, and at the last minute, they delayed his discharge because his obs were fluctuating significantly, and they weren't happy to let him go home that day. However, the next day he was discharged and deemed to be medically fit for discharge home. Now, bear in mind, this was a time during the pandemic when we were not allowed to visit him in hospital, and it was early on in those times, so there was no virtual visiting arrangements either. So we actually had no opportunity to see him from the minute he left the house until he returned home in a transportation ambulance type thing. And the man who returned was a shadow of his former self. He was barely conscious. He looked anything but medically fit, to be honest. And I understand that medically fit doesn't mean that he's going to be up walking around. It just means that he doesn't require acute hospital treatment. But it didn't appear to the lay person that was the case either. So he remained at home then for a week, during which time he continued to deteriorate, to be honest. And my mum obviously was looking after him along with the social care workers. A week after that, then he was so bad that he required readmission to hospital. And on readmission, again, as was the protocol then, he was tested, and this time tested positive. So that was on the 2nd of May, which actually was his 90th birthday. He remained in hospital then over the next few days, but on the 7th of May, which was 5 days after he had been readmitted, my mum was unresponsive at home. Obviously, we weren't allowed to visit her. There was maybe a daily leave the paper on the doorstep sort of call. No one was allowed in houses then, and we were sticking rigidly to the rules for their protection mainly. So we got the police. They got into the house, and she was unresponsive in bed. She was brought to the same hospital, and she tested positive on admission. So that was on the 7th of May, 5 days after Daddy's second admission. They both remained in hospital, received varying levels of treatment appropriate according to their medical status, if you like, their previous medical status prior to admission. And Daddy died on the 10th of May, and then Mummy died on the 14th of May. So those days, there was no funerals either. So we didn't see either of them again. The next time we saw them, they were in boxes being buried. And the funerals were 10 people in attendance. The graveyard workers were wearing full biohazard suits and respirators. We weren't allowed even near the grave. We were kept back with red and white tape, and we were allowed there for a maximum of 15 minutes. And as I said to someone the other day when I was at the inquiry, and it's a strange thought that hadn't really crossed my mind recently, but it just came to me that day, that we buried Daddy on a Thursday. And as we were leaving the grave, the priest turned around and he said to the grave diggers, "There's no point in closing that grave because we'll be back again in a couple of days."
Gosh, that's just horrendous, Fiona. and what you went through is unimaginable. I saw you were one of the participants in the Impact video
Yes.
played before the COVID inquiry began in Belfast. And I have to say it was really moving. But you said that it's your daddy's anniversary on May the 10th, which is obviously tomorrow.
Yes.
It's your mummy's anniversary on Monday, the 14th.
Yeah, it's a strange coincidence that the inquiry comes to Northern Ireland just in parallel to these events unfolding for us, 4 years to the week.
Does it make it any more difficult, or do you feel that there's a chance of some closure at this poignant time?
Closure is a strange one, because I think that was taken away from us by the fact that we weren't allowed to see either of our parents from the minute they left the house in an ambulance. So we never saw either of them again. So closure is a bit of a bone of contention for me, actually, because that removal of wakes and funerals and visiting took that away. It's very hard to have closure when, I'm not saying it's not real, it's very real that they're gone, but in Northern Ireland in particular, we do have certain rituals that we go through when people die that kind of makes it more real and gives you that closure, and we didn't have that. So that, I think, is difficult. But yeah, in response to your main question there, does it make it harder? I guess so, but I don't think the timing really makes it harder. What makes it harder is listening to what we've had to listen to, and it basically plucks you out of this time zone and puts you right back there, and I think that's what the difficulty is. It's not really because it's 4 years later to the day nearly, but I guess that probably is a factor, to be honest.
And obviously you talked about your experience of the funeral, and that was horrible, and nobody should have to go through that. But then, of course, you had Carol Nicola giving evidence this week. I don't know if you heard her, and she had talked about going to Bobby Story's funeral, and she apologised. And I know some other bereaved families that I've spoken to, they said an apology was important. How did you feel about hearing that, given what you've been through?
It's hollow for me, but what I would say to counter that is that I listened to Naomi Long and Edwin Poots today, and Naomi Long did sort of acknowledge that with hindsight, those decisions maybe weren't the best, the decisions that were made. I think it was her department that was responsible for, all those decisions around funerals and how graveyards were opened or closed or whatever, So that, I find that actually more comforting than a hollow apology from someone who did what they wanted to do when no one else could, And sometimes I look back and think, am I the mug that stuck to the rules when the people who were making the rules broke them as and how and when they wanted to?
Nicola, you must be very familiar with stories like this, representing, as you do, bereaved families from across the UK. You're also a hugely experienced solicitor because you've acted on some of the most significant cases in recent times, including the Manchester Arena bombing inquiry and the Hillsborough inquests. What are your thoughts on Module 2C so far and the UK COVID inquiry in general?
Hi, Claire. Thank you very much for having me. Yes, I have heard, unfortunately, many stories like Fiona's. Thank you, Fiona, for sharing them, because it is important that they are shared with the wider public. In terms of the Module 2C hearings, obviously being in England, there's a lot that I'm learning that we're just not aware of over here because it doesn't make the news. So the likes of the cross-community vote, that is all complete news to me. And so it's been interesting to hear about that, but frustrating to see how politics was still being used at such a critical time. I suppose if I compare Module 2C with A in Scotland, B in Wales, and 2, which was UK-wide, the the themes that are really strong for me throughout is no one was consulted about Eat Out to Help Out, whether that was other departments within the UK government or the devolved governments. No one was consulted at all. All the scientists have said it was a bad idea, and they would have told Rishi Sunak if he had bothered to ask. I think the evidence this week was the clearest we've heard that there is just no such thing as a COVID secure place when you are eating indoors. And so the whole concept of that was deeply problematic. But also this current theme of we probably should have gone sooner, but we couldn't do because of how Westminster holds the purse strings, which again must be frustrating for the people who are having to operate under those parameters.
And of course, thank you for that. And yeah, it seems to be it always comes back to the families, because they're the people who had to deal with the aftermath of these questionable choices. And Sarah, if I could just bring you in at this point, because as a paralegal, your role's extremely important when it comes to collating the stories. So I was wondering if you could outline how disclosure works, how many documents have been processed, and how are they used in an inquiry?
Yeah, so thank you, Claire. As Claire said, I work as a paralegal in the wider UK COVID-19 inquiry team at PA Duffy and Co Solicitors. I would say my primary role and that of my colleagues in the paralegal team is to engage in a high-level review of the incoming disclosure from the inquiry. So to give listeners an idea of what that actually entails, our job is to extensively analyse incoming documentation to really identify key evidence in this case. Disclosure is a normal part of many types of legal proceedings, including public inquiries. It is the process whereby, in this case, the inquiry makes relevant evidence available, i.e. it discloses it to core participants in advance of it being examined at the public hearings. So obviously core participants have the right to be provided with all the relevant documentation, and we review this on behalf of our clients to ensure that key information that is really necessary is appropriately escalated to our solicitor and counsel team. What we find a lot of the time that often these key pieces of evidence really help us to piece together the events that took place at this time from what the families have told us in relation to their experience. And of course, this evidence is always coupled with the experience of bereaved families during the pandemic, which really goes on to centrally inform our arguments and submissions at the inquiry. Of course, this documentation comes in many forms and from a range of material providers. To give you an example, in Module 2C, we have been in the process of reviewing over 350,000 pages of relevant disclosure across our team. And this amount does vary across the modules. To look back to Module 1, which was the inquiry's investigation into preparedness, we saw over 300,000 pages of disclosure. And in Module 2, the Module 2's first investigation saw close to 500,000 documents to be reviewed. So key pieces of evidence, as we have seen this week, that are incoming and that our team are reviewing include government documents, email correspondence, reports and presentations that are all relevant to the investigation, to name a few, and obviously they are provided to us on a rolling basis.
Gosh, it sounds like a heavy workload. And what does it feel like to work on a case like this at such an early stage in your career?
That's a very good question. First of all, I would want to say that I feel extremely privileged to work on this case at such an early stage in my career, both in a professional capacity, but also very much in a personal one too. Another part of my role as a paralegal in PA Duffy has been to assist the families throughout this process. And to be honest, I have been really moved by the unwavering resilience that I've seen amongst family members in their quest for accountability. It's been a long time coming for a lot of them, and it's been really moving. Particularly because I am someone who suffered bereavement at a very young age. That experience of grief is something that I know will never leave me. Particularly when I think about my entry into the legal profession, this is something my father and I talked a lot about often. So to stand with families who have suffered bereavement in this particular way, which is totally unique. We are living in unprecedented times of bereavement, and in such circumstances, for families to come to this inquiry despite that with such enormous fortitude and strength, really, that I've seen to work to transform that pain into purpose, and then go on to perform that really bravely and selflessly in memory of the ones they love. It's a sad honour to be a part of, but an honour nonetheless.
Of course, if the families hadn't been so brave and courageous, there wouldn't be this inquiry in the first place. It's all down to them. So maybe we will move on to talk about the witnesses. And I was going to start with this week's witnesses, but maybe we will take a look back to Friday and talk about Jane Broudie. Fiona, I think you might have some thoughts on what she had to tell us about the data loss.
Yeah, I thought her evidence was actually, I thought, really interesting. I thought the way Claire Dobbin set out a chronology at the start of the number of communications there had been from both Cabinet Office and various other government departments on how data should be stored and what sort of data should be stored. And it was set out very explicitly and very clearly that it wasn't just official information. Official information did encompass WhatsApp messages, text messages, and informal communication, if you like. And it was a stark listen when you heard how many times that had been communicated. And she herself indicated that she had taken that on board. She had initiated training courses within the civil service to make sure everybody was aware of that. And it came across as very hard to believe that with the amount of communication, training, and effort, that there should be anyone who would be unaware of what the requirements were in terms of data retention and what sort of data should have been retained. And then we hear of numerous instances, too many instances of data being deleted, and there seemed to be various ways that was done. Some ministers deleted it before they handed back their devices, others handed back their devices, and it seemed incredible to me that there was a department within the civil service, IT Assist or whatever it was called, that actually then cleansed their machines or removed data from them. Now, from a layperson's perspective, that engenders a lack of trust. And it, to me, says that there's something on those machines, those devices, that these ministers don't want to be public knowledge. And then the natural progression is, why do they not want it to be? Is it something that's going to damage them personally? And that is and it's a personal perspective. That is my perspective on that it's something that they prioritize their own personal reputations over what the inquiry can gain from the information that was on those devices. And they prioritize their political careers over public health learnings that will help if this or when this ever happens again. I actually think it's incredible that it happened. But sadly, it's not surprising, because there's been just too many instances of people in these positions who, in my view, abuse their positions. And all of the stuff that went on in Westminster with parties, this, that, and the other, it all just is in the same vein. You know, they're making rules and not sticking by them, but yet expecting everybody else to. And yet, when we try to learn from what happened, they don't even allow that either, because the information that would help the inquiry learn is gone.
And what did you make of Jane Broudie's evidence as head of the civil service in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, I don't think I can put it any better than Fiona already has. I suppose the point is about learning. And before the COVID inquiry in Northern Ireland, there was the RHI inquiry, and very similar issues were identified. And it appears that many of them have not been rectified. So I think the bereaved families would all agree that if there's to be learning from this inquiry, the COVID inquiry, there needs to be a wholesale culture change within government, within the civil service. And there needs to be transparency, because if there isn't, then it leads to these concerns that Fiona has just mentioned.
So if we move on to some of the witnesses this week and start with Richard Pengelly. As permanent secretary in the Department of Health, he had a very influential role both before and during the pandemic. He was asked about the department's role in responding to the pandemic and, crucially, whether there was a delay in that response. He was also questioned about the controversial decision to allow untested patients to be discharged from hospitals into care homes. And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so a really significant witness for this section of the inquiry, not only because he was the permanent secretary in the Department for Health at the beginning of the pandemic, but also because he was in that role in the period where there was no executive in the 3 years before the pandemic. So effectively, in the absence of ministers, he is the primary decision maker. In his evidence to the inquiry, the scene was really set by portraying the historical and systemic issues within health and social care in Northern Ireland. He gave evidence which portrayed a health service under severe strain even before the pandemic. We heard some of the statistics, which are frankly staggering. Northern Ireland have the worst waiting lists in all of the UK, which I think most people know. The figures within that are that 400,000 people out of the 1.9 million population in the country are on waiting or were on waiting lists before the pandemic, and that number has increased since. We also heard about the negative impact that the absence of an executive had in the 3 years before the pandemic. And one practical implication of that for the Department for Health was that there was a stalling of progress in implementing the Bingoa report, which envisaged wide-ranging reforms to the health system. And that didn't happen and wasn't advanced due to the executive not being up and running. Pengelly described the health system as suboptimal, which I think we can agree is probably the understatement of the week. Moving on through his evidence then, the disconnect between the department and the executive office, this was a theme that has been explored with a number of witnesses. And one of the most significant features was the discussion of this silo approach that the Department of Health had at the beginning of the pandemic and the extent to which that affected the response to the pandemic. So Pengelly appeared to struggle with the concept of a lead department. He accepted that the department had responsibility for the health response to a pandemic in January and February 2020, but that didn't mean it had overall responsibility for responding to the pandemic itself. He spoke about NICMA, which is Northern Ireland's civil contingency framework. And that's important because the NICMA arrangements facilitate a cross-government response. So until those are activated, the Department for Health are the lead department effectively. So there was a long discussion about why those arrangements weren't activated sooner, why the department, knowing what they did in February and even January, why they didn't recommend that those arrangements be activated. Pengelly was quick to point out that they didn't need to recommend that those arrangements be stood up for it to happen. And I think that really begs the question, how could any other department or any other minister recommend it, given that the department had all of the relevant information which would be required to make that decision? So some really interesting exchanges there. The other key point was around care homes. We've heard evidence, it's well documented, this policy of discharging hospital patients into care homes. It's a Department for Health policy which McNeilly was centrally involved in. Nicola, it's an issue that you and your clients will be all too familiar with, as well as it was applied elsewhere in the UK. How do you reflect on that?
Thanks, Enda. Yes, I think his evidence was quite stark on this issue. He didn't appear to resile from it, strangely. Even when it was put to him that testing must not be allowed to hold up the discharge. So someone knew exactly what they were doing, that the lack of testing was dangerous. And in his evidence, he said that he agreed that it had the potential to be dangerous, but that their understanding was that there would be mitigations in place. I don't think he was able to actually say what those mitigations were, who was responsible for them, what the guidance was, or how they would work in practice. But he wouldn't agree that the process was reckless, which has been contradicted by a witness who gave evidence today, who has basically said, of course it was reckless and it was a matter of common sense. You didn't need any scientific or medical background to know what would happen. And that's exactly what was warned by Jonathan Van Tam months in advance too. He also was asked about this email exchange on the 20th of April, in which it appears that the Public Health Agency said that it had 500 people being trained to carry out contact tracing. And he said in his evidence that this just wasn't the case. And he queried whether misrepresentation was the correct word. But I'm not sure what other word would be more suitable than a misrepresentation.
Yeah, and on that point, he was under the understanding for months that this was the case, that there was 500 people being trained to perform this role. In reality, I think it was 60 or something. It was much less. So it was a really shocking revelation, that. So Sarah, the exchange between Lady Hallett and McNeilly was interesting. She seemed to pick up on this issue of the lead department, and it was quite bizarre because it was really getting into the weeds of terminology around what that actually means. What were your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so I think my opinion is, in general, of McNeilly's evidence, that it was quite a conflicting watch overall. I do think it was good to see the chair address this. To quote Baroness Hallett, she said during the hearing, "You can't dictate, but you can lead." And I really feel that leaves a lasting impression across the evidence we've heard in Module 2C so far. For me, definitely a stronger implementation of this mentality could have really made all the difference across the response to COVID across the executive.
Of course, another major figure in the Department of Health is Professor Ian Young, the Chief Scientific Officer. He gave evidence on a range of issues, including the inadequacies of Northern Ireland's access to scientific advice. He also put paid to the claim made by former Environment Minister Edwin Poots that COVID was more prevalent in nationalist areas. Enda, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so Professor Young is, again, another major figure, part of this triumvirate within the Department for Health, with McNeilly and the CMO, Professor McBride, being the other two, with obviously Minister Swan involved as well. So one thing, important contextual point in relation to Professor Young, is that he didn't give any scientific advice for the 5 years prior to the pandemic, 2015 to 2020. He didn't give any advice to the executive. This was an issue in Module 1. The reason he provided was that he wasn't asked for advice. Now, that's set against the evidence of Patrick Vallance and others in Module 2, where they say that chief scientific advisors should be proactive in their advice and should give government the advice they need, not the advice that they ask for. That being said, Northern Ireland don't have a executive CSA. Professor Young is a CSA for the Department for Health, so there may be some force in his argument that it's a structural issue rather than an issue of him simply not providing evidence. Another point to note is that he went off on leave in February 2020. He was then asked to return by the CMO and did in March 2020. And only when he returned, I think, were some of the more significant steps taken in respect of modelling and identification of some of the issues with test and trace, for example. And yes, as you mentioned, Claire, the myth around the prevalence of COVID in nationalist areas was dispelled from a scientific perspective. I don't think that was ever in doubt within our group, but it was important that was asked and answered.
We also heard from Peter Weir. He was the first minister. He's a former education minister. He was the first minister to give evidence in Module 2C. He began by offering an apology to bereaved families and went on to discuss school closures, the controversial Bobby Story funeral, and the DUP's cross-community vote in the autumn of 2020. Nicola, I'm not sure if you heard his apology.
I did hear his apology. I think it's always appropriate to start out with an apology if you were someone with the power to make decisions that have an impact on people. I note he didn't actually apologise for the nationalist comments. I think it was just a failure overall. One thing that did strike me was that he was far more interested in talking about what the health department did or didn't do rather than addressing what his department did or didn't do. Obviously, health was the focus of the crisis. And a lot of what he said, I think, was appropriate. It was just striking to me that those criticisms were as forthcoming as they were. He said very clearly that there was a failing in relation to care homes, and that across the executive there was just a level of trust that when the Department of Health said that actions were being taken, they trusted that it was being done, that it was raised on a consistent basis, and they were always kind of battered away with reassurances. Yes, this is being done, this guidance is being rolled out. And he did say it's one of the things that they got badly wrong. But I do wonder really whether that was more about what he's able to say in hindsight rather than him admitting any failures in real time.
If we move on to a Sinn Féin former Minister for Communities, Carol Nicolan, her evidence spoke directly to the Story funeral. And again, we had another apology arising this time from Brenda Campbell KC's questioning over the funeral of the IRA veteran whom she described as a dear friend. Fiona, I think you may have heard her apology. I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on that?
As I said earlier, for me it was hollow. She did what she did. And at that time, she disregarded all of the guidance that was in place that she expected other people to follow. And to me, that was a point which had the potential to unhinge everything that had been achieved in terms of compliance to that point with the general public. Because when there's stark evidence there that everyone can see on television program or news that the people who are making the rules don't themselves abide by them, what's the incentive for the rest of us to do so? And it was, in my opinion, a reckless thing to do, which could have had and may have had serious implications on the trajectory of the pandemic at that point.
Do you think there's a certain amount of backpedaling going on here?
Yes.
And do you think there's an element, when a bereaved family member said to me that they felt, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but they said that they felt that particularly this week, we've seen a lot of people who had positions of power coming out saying they're sorry, as if trying to kind of exonerate themselves now with distance.
Yes.
Is that how you feel also?
Exactly how I feel, yeah. And as I mentioned before, it's about personal protection of their own reputations and their political careers, in my view.
And what do you think? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with Fiona. I think the funeral itself sets in stark contrast to the stories, the many stories that we've heard from bereaved families, either not having a funeral or having one where there's a really limited restrictions. So I think that really rings true in the evidence. You know, it's taken until now for an apology to come about. Yes, it is progress, given that the immediate reaction was to not acknowledge the significance of that and the impact on public messaging and how that might have been perceived. And I think the timing of that's important as well, because this was in June 2020. And then afterwards, we've seen a reduction in compliance with regulations. And I think the families believe that played a big role in that.
And Sarah, you shared with us earlier your experience of grief. Is that something that could really rub salt into the wounds of people who have been trying to come to terms with their grief for such a long time?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think the important thing to remember is that the experience of being COVID bereaved is obviously an entirely different experience from bereavement that we all suffer. And this is something that I've spoke about at length with the families. And I think in ordinary times, you know, part of the process of coming to terms with a loss is being able to build resilience to that grief, to grow around it. From processes that the families were very sadly denied, such as the likes of funerals, and to see their loved ones before they left them. So yes, I definitely think it does.
And as we were saying earlier, some of the rules came from the Department for Justice, and Naomi Long, she was giving evidence earlier today, and she's probably significant because she's the first minister who's not from the DUP or Sinn Féin. So her evidence probably gave a unique perspective on some of the most significant themes, including the Story funeral and, of course, the cross-community vote. So, Enda, could you talk us through perhaps the significance of what she shared with us?
Yeah, a very interesting and refreshing witness, actually, this morning. So she was quite good on the cross-community vote. And for those who don't know what the cross-community vote issue is, it might be helpful to explain that. So this issue arose through a series of meetings of the executive from the 9th to the 12th of November 2020. The purpose of the meetings were to agree to an extension of restrictions on the CMO's advice, and this was in circumstances where Northern Ireland were in a particularly bad place with rates of infection. The purpose of cross-community voting is generally to protect minority interests within the executive, and so it wouldn't typically be used by the party with the biggest majority, i.e. the DUP, but by smaller parties such as the SDLP or the Ulster Unionists. So for a cross-community vote to pass, it needs the majority of both nationalist and unionist communities in Northern Ireland to vote in favour. And it would typically be used for constitutional issues such as Good Friday Agreement issues, cultural or language issues, certainly not for public health issues. So that was all broken down very well by Naomi Long. And in practical terms, Naomi Long said that the vote operates as a veto, which allowed the DUP to block the public health measures that were being suggested. And despite the fact that the measures themselves were being proposed by a minister who was himself unionist, Robin Swan. So the whole genesis of this idea that it wasn't political game playing, I don't think is accepted at all by the bereaved families, and I think Long described it accurately as an egregious abuse of power. I suppose, Nicola, I'd be interested to hear your views on that. That you've been listening across Module 2A, 2B, Module 2. Obviously, I can't see that an issue like this could have ever cropped up because the political systems are just so different there.
I was really grateful to hear the evidence of Naomi Long today, because as I said at the outset, this idea of a cross-community vote, I'd never heard of it before. And I've heard witnesses mention it throughout Module 2C. But the views were so diametrically opposite that I couldn't make sense of it. So on the one hand, I was being told that it's not meant to be used in this way, it was inappropriate. And on the other hand, I was being told, but it's only because we were striving for a compromise and we really didn't want to have to go to a majority vote. And both of those things sounded reasonable. And then today she just smashed through all of that, put it all into its proper context, explained what the vote was originally designed for, which was to ensure that the minority voices are heard, that they can't be shouted down, and that this was, as Enda's just quoted, a completely egregious misuse of a mechanism that wasn't designed to simply bully your way through to get to the answer that you wanted, which was also overriding the evidence of the scientists. So I was very grateful to her for her evidence on that issue, but also on the Bobby Story funeral. She just put that in its proper context for me today, which was, she explained that one of her constituents was actually the family after the Bobby Story funeral. And they were forced to abide by the limited numbers and weren't able to give the send-off that they would have wanted to do. And it is just this entitlement of do as I say, not as I do. For whatever reason, I'm allowed to have the things that you aren't allowed to have. And as Enda said, she was a refreshing witness who just seemed to cut through a lot of the, that we've heard from other witnesses.
So speaking of contentious points of view, just to touch a little bit on Edwin Poots, the former Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs Minister. When he was giving evidence earlier, he was highly critical of the Department of Health and Robin Swan, the Health Minister. He was also the DUP minister who proposed the cross-community vote in the autumn of 2020. So I'll pass over to Enda to look a bit deeper into that.
Yeah, so Edwin Poots touched on, I think, three of the key topics from this week that I mentioned at the start of the podcast, that being the Story funeral, obviously the cross-community vote that we've just discussed, but also these issues with the Department for Health. And it's very clear that he was critical of the department from an early stage. It seems that the reliance of Poots and his party colleagues on the CMO's advice and medical advice generally in March and the early stages of the pandemic seemed to dissipate as time went on. And there was more of an environment of challenge, as they put it, towards the CMO's advice. In relation to the cross-community vote, again, Poots was questioned about his tweets at the time. So he was tweeting effectively the same days that the meetings were happening, and he was preempting some of the information that would come out subsequently. So essentially, he was tweeting about the need to avoid other societal impacts that can be caused by the public health restrictions. We're talking about economic factors and things like that. So that could be seen as an attempt to get the public on side before the vote happened and the subsequent events which followed. That's similar to the leaking that has happened, and we've heard a lot of evidence about leaking from all parties, where parties are seeking to gain an advantage for their stance by leaking to the media in advance and getting the media on side to support their outcome with what happens next. But it feeds into the whole theme of political dysfunction, and a system that operates like that is one that cannot operate effectively. Fiona, I think you followed along with Poots' evidence today as well. What did you think?
Started off quite moving, I thought, because one of the first things he talked about was his own father dying and the restrictions that were obviously imposed on him, as were the rest of us. But he did abide by those, and I think I can relate to him. It's not often I say that, but I can relate to him in terms of I can share the feelings of anger he has, that he stuck to those rules while others didn't. But for the rest of his evidence, it sort of deteriorated from there for me. He seemed to kind of blame the Department of Health nearly for the decisions they were making, and he disputed, I think, a lot of them without giving any real rationale as to, or supporting evidence, if you like, as to why he disputed them. I think he was asked about that a couple of times, as did he have a good reason to dispute the things that they were asking for, and he didn't. It was a bit baseless, I thought, his responses to that.
I think that was on the point of questioning the scientific advice subsequently, but also not offering any alternatives at the time.
Yes.
And not offering any solutions. So I actually thought that was a good point.
Yes.
Okay, so after another very busy week of evidence, I'm going to ask each of you to pick a standout moment or tell us about your biggest takeaway. So Sarah, I'll ask you first.
Yeah, so for me, it definitely has to be the point that I touched upon previously. I mean, the words of Baroness Hallett, you cannot dictate, but you can lead is something that I'm going to remember even after evidence concludes. I mean, this is something that I think as a paralegal, review and disclosure, we have seen time and time again. Something that really sticks out in my mind throughout this whole process is the failure to take positive steps. To lead is essential. And I mean, we've seen it in the disclosure. The families have very sadly had to experience it, but the impacts of a delayed and dysfunctional response to COVID-19 in Northern Ireland, I really echo the words of the families when they say for those loved and those lost really did deserve better.
Nicola, what about you?
So it was something that happened on Friday morning, and it was Claire Dobbin Casey, and it was her carefully controlled but barely concealed, quiet but white hot rage with the executive. And she said that very, very calmly that a disclosure issue had arisen. And she said that she had received an email from the lawyers on behalf of the executive setting out that they were very surprised to hear the inquiry say they hadn't received the notes of a meeting on the 2nd of July, because here they are. And she just went through date after date after date in which the inquiry had requested these notes and either being ignored or told they didn't exist. And it was just the most powerful forensic takedown. And I almost felt sorry for the lawyers who had written that letter to her, but only almost.
Fiona, what about you?
Mine's not so much a highlight as a low light. And I guess for anyone who's used to living in Northern Ireland and used to the petty party politics that go on over here and the use of religion and political affiliation as excuses for a lot of things, then I think what this inquiry to date has shown is that nothing has changed, despite the nice, shiny sort of front that we have here, that our society has been transformed. You scratch the surface and it's all still there. And the people who we elect and who we put in roles that we expect will enhance our society, its economics, and in this case, the healthcare system for all the citizens who put those people in these positions. It appears to me that their own personal political agendas trump everything. And it's very disappointing that we still hear stories of people, for example, a minister saying that a virus will spread more quickly in nationalist areas, or a cross-community vote being used to veto advice that has come based on science from a CMO or a CSA, that restrictions should be maintained for a little bit longer. This virus didn't distinguish between Catholics or Protestants. It was indiscriminate. It didn't even, obviously it was heavily weighted, the deaths were heavily weighted to older people, but there's plenty of younger people who suffered from death or long COVID or other implications due to the virus. So it was totally indiscriminate. And for anyone to suggest that your political affiliation or your religion made you more vulnerable to this virus is, in my view, absolutely despicable. And it saddens me to think that we haven't really moved on that far, that when a crisis like this comes along, everyone reverts back to type, and the flag and the religion and the party that they support is more important. And for those politicians, I think they should actually be ashamed of themselves, that they've done their electorate a huge disservice in the way they've acted. So that, unfortunately, is my sort of low light from this week.
And I think a lot of people would agree with you completely on that. Last but not least, Enda.
Yeah, I think mine is probably the Naomi Long evidence as a whole. And it follows on from what Fiona has said. It's probably impossible to keep petty party politics out of a module of the inquiry like this. But Naomi Long's evidence was as balanced as I think we're going to get, particularly in relation to the issues of the cross-community vote and the Bobby Story funeral, which are issues which each of the major parties here, must answer for, they must front up to. And it's something that's of real concern to the clients. So to get a deep dive into both of those issues and what was happening behind the scenes was really useful.
I just think it's important to say that we need to make sure that any recommendations from this inquiry are actually enacted in some way, shape or form, and there's mechanisms in place to ensure that that happens. I draw a parallel to a serious adverse incident investigation that I actually fought to get instigated regarding my parents' deaths with the trust concerned, and drove every waking hour for 2 to 3 years. The end result was a report full of recommendations and identification of many, many things that went wrong. So in a way, I draw that parallel to this, albeit on a very minuscule scale compared to this. But the process and the end result, the output, is identical. And what cannot happen from this is that there's a report will be generated, as was done in our case, submitted full of recommendations. And when the recipients who are entrusted to implement those recommendations come back, as in our case, with, we would love to, but it's too challenging. That cannot happen in this case. There needs to be some way, and I think that will come from pressure from people who elect these politicians, because at the end of the day, that's all they're interested in, is keeping their followers and making sure they have enough followers to get them into power again. So if we can hold them to account and make sure that when these recommendations, and I'm sure there will be many, many of them, are actually documented by Baroness Hallett, that someone somewhere stands up and says they will make sure that they happen. And that's the only way that any of this will be worthwhile.
Yes, so with that in mind, we have a big week coming up in the inquiry. We have some of the major witnesses to hear from at the end of week 2 and beginning of week 3, with the CMO, Michael McBride, giving evidence tomorrow, which is Friday. Week 3, then, we have former Health Minister Robin Swan, as well as experts who the inquiry have instructed to provide an overview of Northern Ireland and its political systems in particular. On Tuesday, we have Michelle O'Neill. On Wednesday, we have Arlene Foster. And on Thursday, we have Sue Gray, as well as the closing submissions from all core participants, including for Northern Ireland bereaved families for justice. So some major points to pick up with each of those witnesses, and we look forward to welcoming everyone back next week to discuss that. In the meantime, thanks very much to all of our guests, Nicola, Sarah and Fiona, and we'll hope to see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share it with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinions, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.